Part 1, The Forgotten Empire, Whispers in the Dust of Anatolia. For centuries, the world believed it already knew the great powers that shaped the ancient world. Egypt with its golden pharaohs, Babylon with its towering ziggurats, Assyria with its ruthless armies. Yet buried beneath the windswept plains and rocky ridges of central Anatolia lay the remains of another empire, one so mighty that it once stood as the equal of Ramses the Great himself, and yet so forgotten that even its name had vanished from human memory. This was the world of the Hittites, a civilization that rose from the rugged heart of modern-day Turkey to dominate the Bronze Age, only to disappear so completely that for almost 3,000 years, no one knew they had ever existed. Their rediscovery in the late 19th century was one of the most astonishing moments in archaeological history, as scholars and explorers slowly pieced together the story of a people whose power, complexity, and innovation had been erased by time itself. It began with whispers, faint references in the Bible to a mysterious people called the Hittites, whose origins and nature puzzled historians for centuries. Some thought they were a minor tribe of Canaan, others dismissed them as myth. But the truth, when uncovered, would challenge everything scholars thought they knew about the ancient Near East. The first real clue emerged in 1834 when a French explorer named Charles Texier wandered through the central Anatolian highlands and stumbled upon the ruins of enormous stone fortifications, scattered with strange hieroglyphs unlike anything he had ever seen. The local villagers called the place Bogazkoy. To Texier, it was nothing less than the ghost of a lost world: massive walls, carved lions guarding crumbling gates, and fragments of inscriptions that spoke of a forgotten grandeur. He had no idea that he was standing amid the ruins of Hattusa, once the capital of one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world. For decades after Texier's discovery, no one could decipher the meaning of the strange markings found on those stones. The hieroglyphs were unlike Egyptian writing, and the clay tablets that surfaced nearby contained cuneiform signs that didn't match any known language. The mystery deepened. Then, in the early 1900s, excavations led by Hugo Winkler and Theodore Macready began to unearth thousands upon thousands of these tablets from the ruins of Hattusa's royal archives. It was an astonishing find, a library of ancient diplomacy, religion, law, and myth. And when scholars finally cracked the code of the Hittite language, the lost empire began to speak again. The clay tablets told of kings and queens, wars and treaties, gods and rituals, all belonging to a people who had once ruled a vast domain stretching from the Aegean coast to the Euphrates River. The world was forced to confront a humbling truth, that an entire civilization, as sophisticated and powerful as Egypt or Mesopotamia, had been forgotten for over 3,000 years. To understand how such a thing could happen, we must go back to the beginning, to the time before Egypt and Babylon had reached their peaks, when the land of Anatolia was a mosaic of small kingdoms and mountain tribes. In this rugged region, surrounded by plateaus and rivers, a people known as the Hutti once ruled. They built fortified cities and worshipped storm gods who controlled the weather and harvests. But around the early 2nd millennium BCE, newcomers arrived, Indo-European-speaking migrants who brought with them new tools, new weapons, and a new language. These were the ancestors of the Hittites. Over time, they mingled with the local Hutti people, adopting their gods and much of their culture while adding their own traditions. From this fusion emerged a new kingdom, one that would rise to dominate Anatolia and eventually challenge the great powers of its age. The earliest known Hittite kings ruled from a city called Kanesh, a bustling trading hub connected to Mesopotamia through Assyrian merchants. Clay tablets discovered there reveal the earliest forms of the Hittite language, written in cuneiform borrowed from their Assyrian neighbors. These records show a society already complex and ambitious, with organized trade, diplomacy, and social hierarchy. But the true center of Hittite power would soon shift northward, to a city that would become legendary, Hattusa. Set amid rocky cliffs and rolling hills, Hattusa was both a fortress and a symbol, a city designed to endure. Its massive stone walls snaked across the hills for miles, enclosing temples, palaces, and granaries. At its gates stood colossal lions and sphinxes carved from solid stone, guardians of an empire that believed itself protected by divine power. From here, the Hittite kings would launch campaigns that reshaped the political map of the Bronze Age. What made the Hittites remarkable was not only their military strength but also their intelligence and adaptability. They were not content to destroy, they absorbed, copied, and improved. From Mesopotamia, they borrowed writing, from the Hutti, their gods, from their rivals, their weapons. They created a vast pantheon of deities, each one representing an aspect of nature, law, or life, merging local and foreign gods into a single, flexible belief system. Their legal codes were surprisingly advanced for their time, emphasizing compensation over revenge and showing a concern for fairness that echoed centuries later in other civilizations. They built roads that linked distant provinces, developed an organized bureaucracy, and maintained archives that preserved everything from treaties to royal decrees. In every sense, the Hittites were builders, not just of stone, but of systems, alliances, and ideas. Yet the Hittites were also a people of contradictions. They could be pragmatic diplomats one day and ruthless conquerors the next. Their kings claimed to be chosen by the gods but often rose to power through betrayal, murder, and civil war. Hittite history is filled with palace intrigues, family rivalries, and usurpations that mirror the drama of later empires. But despite their internal struggles, they managed to hold together an empire that stretched across Anatolia, controlling key trade routes and natural resources. They forged diplomatic ties with Egypt and Babylon and became the first people in history to record a formal peace treaty, a document that still survives today on clay and stone, bearing witness to their sophistication and vision. For all their achievements, the Hittites were not immortal. Like so many empires before and after them, they would eventually fall to war, famine, and the chaos of a changing world. But their rediscovery reminds us that history is fragile, and memory even more so. The Hittites teach us that greatness can vanish not in a single catastrophe but through the slow erosion of time, when the voices of the past are silenced by the winds of forgetfulness. Yet even in silence, their legacy endured, in the myths that inspired later civilizations, in the treaties that shaped diplomacy, in the stones of their ruined cities that still stand against the Anatolian sky. As we begin this journey into their world, we are not just exploring a vanished civilization. We are listening to an ancient echo, the murmur of a people who once stood among the giants of history, whose empire rose, burned brightly, and was lost to dust. The story of the Hittites is not just about power or conquest, it is about the endurance of human curiosity, the way knowledge waits patiently beneath the soil for rediscovery. And as we continue through the chapters of this forgotten empire, we will see how the Hittites carved their legacy in both stone and memory, shaping a chapter of humanity that refused to remain buried forever. Part 2: The Rise of Hattusa, Fortress of Kings. In the heart of the Anatolian highlands, surrounded by rugged hills and sweeping plateaus, there once stood a city carved out of the very bones of the earth. Its walls, built from limestone and basalt, seemed to grow naturally from the jagged terrain, their gray faces catching the sunlight like mirrors of eternity. This was Hattusa, the beating heart of the Hittite Empire, a city that would become both a symbol of imperial strength and a stage for the ambitions, triumphs, and tragedies of kings who believed themselves chosen by the gods. To the people who lived within its walls, Hattusa was more than a capital, it was the center of the universe, a place where divine will met human determination. But before it became the grand fortress of kings, it had to rise from fire, conquest, and chaos. Long before Hattusa became the capital of an empire, it was a city of the Hutti, the indigenous people who had given the land its name, the land of Hutti. The early Hittites, newcomers to the region, had settled among them, slowly integrating with the local population while bringing their Indo-European language and traditions. The first mention of Hattusa in history, however, is not one of glory, but of destruction. A Hittite king named Anita, ruling from the city of Kanesh around 1700 BCE, recorded a campaign in which he laid waste to Hattusa and cursed it, declaring that whoever tried to rebuild it would be struck down by the gods. "May the storm god strike him," his inscription proclaimed. Ironically, centuries later, his own descendants would defy that curse and choose Hattusa as the heart of their empire. In doing so, they would transform a burned ruin into one of the most magnificent cities of the Bronze Age. The man who defied Anita's curse was Hattusili I, the founder of the old Hittite kingdom. His reign marks the beginning of the Hittite state as a powerful, centralized kingdom rather than a collection of warring city-states. When Hattusili chose Hattusa as his capital around 1650 BCE, he did more than pick a strategic location, he made a declaration of divine favor and imperial destiny. The city's location was ideal for defense, perched high above fertile valleys, surrounded by natural rock formations, and close to key trade routes that connected Anatolia with Syria and Mesopotamia. Its elevation allowed it to serve as both a fortress and a sanctuary, a place where the king could rule and the gods could dwell. To establish his authority, Hattusili undertook massive building projects, erecting walls, temples, and palaces that would endure for centuries. Each stone laid in those walls was a challenge to the gods, a sign that the curse of Anita had been broken, and that the age of the Hittites had begun. Hattusili I was not content to rule over central Anatolia. His ambition stretched far beyond his mountainous homeland. He launched campaigns into northern Syria, capturing cities that had once been loyal to the powerful kingdom of Yamhad, and brought vast riches and slaves back to Hattusa. These early conquests served two purposes. They expanded the Hittite sphere of influence and brought back vital trade goods such as copper, tin, and silver, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age economy. Yet even as his armies marched across distant lands, Hattusili struggled to maintain control at home. Rebellions broke out among the nobles, and his own family turned against him. His final years were marked by conflict and disappointment, but before he died, he named his grandson Mursalai as his successor, a decision that would change the course of history. Mursalai I inherited not just his grandfather's empire, but also his ambition. He was young, daring, and determined to prove that the Hittites were more than just a regional power. In one of the most astonishing campaigns of the ancient world, Mursalai led his armies across hundreds of miles, over mountains and deserts, to the very heart of Mesopotamia. There, in 1595 BCE, he captured the city of Babylon, the mighty Babylon of Hammurabi's legacy, and brought its treasures back to Hattusa. It was a feat that shocked the known world. For a brief moment, the Hittites stood as masters of both Anatolia and Mesopotamia. But Mursalai's triumph was short-lived. As he returned to his homeland, his own brother-in-law conspired against him, assassinating him and plunging the kingdom into chaos. The empire fractured, and for a generation, the Hittites teetered on the brink of collapse. What followed was a century of instability, a dark age marked by power struggles, invasions, and the erosion of royal authority. The once great city of Hattusa suffered, its walls breached and its temples desecrated. Yet, remarkably, the Hittite civilization did not disappear. Out of this turmoil emerged a succession of kings who sought to restore order and legitimacy. Among them was Telepainu, a ruler remembered not for conquest but for his wisdom and reform. Around 1525 BCE, Telepainu issued a proclamation known as the Edict of Telepainu, one of the most extraordinary documents of the ancient world. In it, he lamented the violence and corruption that had consumed the royal family and established new laws of succession to prevent further bloodshed. The edict reads like both a confession and a constitution, a plea for stability in a world that had lost its balance. Under his guidance, the Hittite kingdom survived its first great test, preserving its institutions and preparing for a new era of strength. By the time the Middle Kingdom period began, Hattusa had once again risen to prominence. The city itself grew into an urban marvel of its time, surrounded by massive fortifications that stretched for miles, with monumental gates decorated with stone lions and gods. The architecture of Hattusa reflected the Hittite worldview, order imposed on chaos, stone upon stone, human will overcoming the unpredictable forces of nature. Inside the city, life was both practical and spiritual. Scribes busied themselves copying and translating tablets, priests performed daily rituals in temple courtyards, and artisans worked metal, clay, and wood into objects of beauty and power. The city pulsed with purpose, its population bound by loyalty to the king and devotion to the gods. Religion was the heartbeat of Hittite society, and nowhere was this more visible than in Hattusa. The Hittites worshipped a vast pantheon, over 1,000 gods by some counts, many adopted from the cultures they encountered and conquered. At the top of this divine hierarchy stood the storm god of Hutti and the sun goddess of Arina, whose union symbolized the harmony of heaven and earth. The king, considered the earthly representative of these deities, was responsible for maintaining the sacred balance between gods and humans. Failure to honor this duty could bring disaster, drought, plague, or war. Every ritual, every festival, every offering in Hattusa was meant to ensure the continued favor of the divine. The city itself was a map of the cosmos, with temples serving as anchors between the spiritual and mortal realms. As Hattusa's walls grew higher and its influence spread farther, the Hittites began to develop something that set them apart from their contemporaries, a deep sense of order and administration. They were among the first to maintain vast archives of official correspondence, treaties, and laws. Clay tablets discovered in Hattusa's archives reveal a government that prized record-keeping, diplomacy, and organization. Through these documents, we see a society that understood the importance of communication and bureaucracy, the very things that would later allow empires like Rome and Persia to flourish. The Hittites' use of treaties, especially their emphasis on mutual oaths and divine witnesses, would influence the political thought of later civilizations. In many ways, the seeds of international diplomacy were sown in the offices and temples of Hattusa. Yet the Hittite kings also understood the fragility of power. They ruled through a delicate balance of strength and faith, knowing that rebellion could ignite at any moment. Their empire was a living organism, vast, interconnected, but vulnerable. Maintaining it required constant vigilance, negotiation, and sometimes brutal force. The kings of Hattusa were not only warriors but also administrators, judges, and priests. Their success depended on their ability to command loyalty not just from armies, but from the hearts and minds of their people. By the 15th century BCE, Hattusa had truly become the fortress of kings. Its walls enclosed a world that was both sacred and strategic, a city where history, myth, and politics converged. The Hittites had survived internal collapse, foreign threats, and divine curses to re-establish their dominance. But even greater challenges awaited them. To the south, powerful states in Syria and Egypt were beginning to expand their influence. To the north and west, new tribes stirred restlessly beyond the borders. The stage was set for an age of expansion, diplomacy, and confrontation, an age in which the Hittites would rise from regional rulers to global players in the great game of Bronze Age politics. Hattusa, born from ashes and defiance, stood ready. Its gates opened not just to traders and soldiers, but to history itself. For in the coming centuries, from the reigns of mighty kings like Suppiluliuma to the legendary Battle of Kadesh, the Hittites would carve their legacy into the memory of the ancient world. But their rise, as always, would come at a cost, for every fortress, no matter how mighty, carries within it the seeds of its own fall. Part 3, Suppiluliuma and the Age of Conquest. The Hittite world had endured centuries of upheaval, internal strife, rebellion, and the collapse of dynasties, yet from this turbulence emerged one of the most formidable rulers in ancient history, a man whose name would echo through the halls of Hattusa for generations, Suppiluliuma I. To understand the power and charisma of Suppiluliuma is to glimpse the very soul of the Hittite Empire at its zenith, an age when ambition burned hotter than the Anatolian sun, when armies marched across continents, and when diplomacy, deceit, and divine favor wove together in a tapestry of empire. Under his reign, the Hittites would rise from a fractured kingdom to a global power, standing shoulder to shoulder with the great civilizations of Egypt, Babylon, and Mitanni. But behind every triumph, behind every glittering campaign and treaty, lay the fragile heartbeat of a man who knew that power was as fleeting as the wind that swept over the walls of Hattusa. When Suppiluliuma ascended the throne around 1344 BCE, the Hittite kingdom was in a precarious state. His father, Tudhaliya III, had struggled to maintain stability as enemies closed in from all directions. The Kaska tribes to the north, wild mountain people who harassed Hittite lands with relentless raids, had become an unending threat, while in the south, the kingdom of Mitanni, once a Hittite ally, had grown into a formidable rival. Even within the royal court, dissent festered. Suppiluliuma inherited not the glory of an empire, but its ruins, yet what he lacked in inheritance, he made up for in determination. His early years were spent not in the comfort of palaces but in the crucible of war. He learned to lead men, to outthink his rivals, and to rebuild what others had allowed to crumble. He was not just a warrior, he was a strategist and a statesman, a ruler who understood that to secure the throne of Hattusa, one had to command both sword and word. One of his first acts as king was to restore order to the core of the empire. He re-established control over rebellious territories, rebuilt fortresses, and reorganized the military. His leadership was methodical and ruthless. Suppiluliuma had no patience for disloyalty. Those who betrayed him often met swift and brutal ends. But beneath his iron discipline was a vision, to transform the Hittites into the supreme power of the Near East. To achieve this, he needed to look beyond Anatolia's rugged borders toward the lands of Syria and Mesopotamia, where wealth, trade, and influence converged like rivers. These were the lands once controlled by the Mitanni, an empire that had grown complacent, weakened by internal rivalries and foreign pressure. Suppiluliuma saw in their weakness an opportunity to build his own strength. The first campaigns of Suppiluliuma's reign were a masterclass in calculated aggression. He moved swiftly against the Mitanni vassals in northern Syria, capturing key cities such as Aleppo and Alalak. These were not mere conquests of land, they were conquests of power, securing trade routes and cutting off Mitanni's influence. Suppiluliuma's armies, disciplined and relentless, used chariots to devastating effect, striking swiftly across open plains and retreating into fortified camps when threatened. Each victory brought new tribute, new soldiers, and new allies. His military prowess was matched only by his skill in diplomacy. Suppiluliuma did not seek to destroy Mitanni outright. Instead, he sought to absorb it, to turn its allies into his own and to use its weaknesses to his advantage. In this, he succeeded brilliantly. At the same time, he redefined Hittite kingship. The king was no longer merely a servant of the gods but a manifestation of divine will. Suppiluliuma styled himself as the chosen of the storm god, the protector of order in a chaotic world. Every campaign, every treaty, every victory was framed as a fulfillment of divine destiny. In the temples of Hattusa, priests performed rituals in his name, and scribes recorded his achievements on clay tablets that would survive for millennia. These texts speak of a man driven by purpose, aware of his role in history, yet haunted by the fragility of human greatness. For all his triumphs, Suppiluliuma knew that empires, like men, were mortal. His conquests soon drew the attention of other great powers, particularly Egypt. At this time, Egypt was ruled by Pharaoh Akhenaten, the heretic king who had appended centuries of tradition by worshipping a single god, Aten, the sun disk. While Akhenaten's radical religious reforms consumed his attention, Suppiluliuma expanded northward unchecked. The balance of power in the ancient world was shifting, and the Hittites stood poised to dominate. By the height of his reign, Suppiluliuma controlled an empire stretching from the Aegean coast to the banks of the Euphrates, a vast dominion of cities, vassal states, and conquered peoples, all bound together by Hittite law, trade, and fear. But his most remarkable achievement was not on the battlefield. It was a diplomatic masterstroke that has no equal in Bronze Age history. After the death of Akhenaten, Egypt fell into disarray. The pharaoh's widow, known in Hittite records as Dakamanzu, believed by many to be Queen Enkesenamen, sent a desperate letter to Suppiluliuma. Her words, inscribed on clay, have survived through the ages: "My husband is dead, and I have no son. They say you have many sons. If you will send me one of your sons, he shall become my husband, and I shall make him king in Egypt. Never shall I take a servant of mine and make him my husband." It was an extraordinary request, the Queen of Egypt, the most powerful nation on earth, asking the Hittite king for a husband. For Suppiluliuma, this was an opportunity unlike any other. If his son became pharaoh, the Hittite and Egyptian empires could be united through marriage, creating the most formidable alliance the ancient world had ever seen. Yet Suppiluliuma was cautious. He suspected a trap. Egypt was unstable, torn between factions loyal to the old gods and those devoted to Akhenaten's new cult. But after further correspondence, he was convinced of the queen's sincerity and sent his son Zenanza to Egypt with a royal escort. What happened next remains one of the great mysteries of history. Zenanza never reached Egypt. Somewhere along the way, he was murdered, perhaps by political rivals, perhaps by hostile Egyptian generals. When news of his son's death reached Hattusa, Suppiluliuma's grief turned to fury. He launched a massive invasion of Egyptian-held Syria, capturing border cities and bringing home thousands of prisoners. The campaign was victorious, but it came at a terrible cost. Among the captives was a plague, a disease that would sweep through the Hittite Empire, killing soldiers, nobles, and eventually, the king himself. Suppiluliuma's death was both tragic and symbolic. He had built his empire through force of will, defied enemies on every front, and envisioned a dynasty that would rule for generations. Yet in the end, it was not a rival army that defeated him, but an invisible enemy carried by his own triumph. The plague that began in his conquests ravaged Hattusa for years, decimating its population and weakening its foundations. His eldest son, Arnawanda II, inherited the throne but succumbed to the same illness shortly thereafter. It was left to the younger son, Mursalai II, to restore the kingdom and preserve his father's legacy. Despite his untimely death, Suppiluliuma's influence endured. Under his reign, the Hittites had reached the peak of their power, their borders stretching farther than ever before. The cities of Syria and Canaan paid tribute to Hattusa, and the great powers of the world treated the Hittite king as an equal. His reign transformed the Hittites from a mountain kingdom into a true empire, an empire bound by roads, treaties, and a shared identity. Even in their tablets, one can sense the pride of a people who believed they had fulfilled their divine purpose. Yet within that pride lurked the first hints of overreach. Empires built on conquest often find their strength tested not by enemies abroad, but by the weight of their own greatness. The story of Suppiluliuma is not merely that of a conqueror, it is the story of ambition, of how a man born in a fractured land united it through courage and cunning, only to be undone by forces beyond his control. His reign reminds us that history is not written only in victories and monuments but also in the unseen consequences of power. As the fires of his empire burned brightly, casting their light across the ancient world, they also began to consume the very foundations upon which they stood. The gods of Hutti, who had smiled upon him in battle, now demanded their due. And so, as the echoes of Suppiluliuma's triumphs faded through the mountains of Anatolia, the empire stood at a crossroads, stronger than ever, yet more fragile than it appeared. The throne of Hattusa passed to a new generation, one born in the shadow of greatness and burdened with the task of preserving it. The world was changing. The Hittites had risen to the heights of power, but new storms were gathering beyond their borders. In the next chapter of their story, under King Mursalai II, they would face not only the wrath of nature and rebellion but also the weight of destiny itself. Part 4, Mursalai II, the king who faced the gods. When Suppiluliuma's mighty heart fell silent, the empire trembled. The great conqueror who had expanded Hutti's dominion across continents left behind not a golden age, but an empire infected, literally and spiritually. The plague that had entered the kingdom with the Egyptian prisoners spread like wildfire, ravaging the capital and leaving the once mighty city of Hattusa heavy with mourning. Entire families were extinguished, priests, soldiers, and nobles fell alike. In this shadow of despair, a young man named Mursalai II, barely in his 20s, found himself seated upon the most dangerous throne in the world. He had not been raised to rule. The weight of empire was thrust upon his shoulders suddenly, without preparation, and with every whisper of doubt echoing through the marble corridors of the palace. Mursalai's first days as king were marked by grief. The bodies of his father, Suppiluliuma, and his brother, Arnawanda II, still lay within the sacred tombs of the royal necropolis, their spirits restless under the eyes of the gods. The young king inherited not only their crown but also their curse. Across the realm, rebellion flared like dry tinder catching flame. The distant vassal states of Arzawa and Casca refused tribute, Mitanni vassals plotted rebellion, and the plague continued its merciless devastation. Yet despite this crushing beginning, Mursalai II would emerge as one of the most remarkable rulers in Hittite history, a man of introspection, intelligence, and relentless faith. His reign was not one of grand conquests but of restoration, justice, and spiritual reckoning. From the start, Mursalai approached kingship differently than his father. While Suppiluliuma's legacy had been carved in bronze and fire, Mursalai's would be etched in words and prayers. He believed that his duty extended beyond empire building, it was to restore harmony between man and the divine. The Hittite worldview placed gods at the very center of existence. When disaster struck, it was not merely bad fortune, it was divine displeasure. The plague, to Mursalai, was not just a disease, it was a message. Somewhere, somehow, the balance had been broken, and the gods demanded repentance. He began what would become one of the most extraordinary acts of royal devotion in ancient history, a series of prayers and confessions recorded on clay tablets, known today as the Plague Prayers of Mursalai II. In these haunting texts, Mursalai speaks not as an untouchable monarch but as a mortal pleading before forces far beyond his control. My father sinned against the gods, he admits. He took oaths and broke them. Now the gods' anger has turned against the land. It was a moment of vulnerability rare among ancient kings, a recognition that power, no matter how vast, could not shield one from the wrath of heaven. These prayers are deeply human. They reveal a ruler tormented by guilt, uncertainty, and the heavy silence of gods who would not answer. He sought to atone for his father's broken promises, to cleanse his empire of the divine anger that had brought plague and rebellion. Every temple, every oracle, every priestly ritual was turned toward the same goal, reconciliation with the divine. But Mursalai's reign was not only about spiritual renewal. He was also a capable general and administrator who understood that faith without strength could not preserve an empire. In his early campaigns, he personally led expeditions against rebellious vassal states in western Anatolia. The region of Arzawa, a confederation of powerful cities that had long resisted Hittite control, rose in open defiance, emboldened by Hutti's apparent weakness. Mursalai, still young and untested, took the field himself. His soldiers, weary from years of plague and loss, needed a symbol of hope, a reason to believe that the gods had not abandoned them. The campaign against Arzawa was grueling, fought through rugged terrain and shifting alliances. But Mursalai's leadership, calm, strategic, and relentless, won the day. One by one, the rebellious cities fell. The capture of Apasa, modern Ephesus, marked a turning point. The victory was not only military but psychological. It showed that even in its darkest hour, the Hittite Empire could still command loyalty and fear. The defeated kings were brought to Hattusa, their oaths renewed under the watchful eyes of the storm god. Through these victories, Mursalai not only reclaimed lost lands but also reasserted the sacred order of the world, one in which the king ruled by divine mandate, as the intermediary between mortals and gods. Yet even as his armies triumphed abroad, the plague at home continued its grim harvest. Every triumph on the battlefield seemed to be matched by loss in the temples. The young king could not escape the reality that his empire was dying from within. In his writings, Mursalai's tone oscillates between hope and despair. He begged the gods for signs, omens in the flight of birds, dreams, or the flicker of flames on the altar. When silence persisted, he questioned whether humanity could ever truly understand divine justice. His introspection, preserved in cuneiform, gives modern readers a rare glimpse into the soul of an ancient king. Unlike the bombast of Egyptian or Assyrian inscriptions, Mursalai's words are intimate and human, filled with doubt and longing. They reveal a ruler who, for all his power, was deeply aware of his own fragility. But faith and pragmatism often coexist uneasily. While Mursalai prayed for forgiveness, he also tightened his grip on the machinery of state. He strengthened Hutti's borders, reformed the administration of vassal territories, and revitalized trade. The royal archives of Hattusa flourished under his reign. Scribes recorded treaties, decrees, and correspondences in exquisite cuneiform, creating one of the most extensive collections of historical documents in the ancient world. It was under Mursalai's guidance that the Hittite bureaucracy reached new levels of sophistication. His vision of kingship was one of balance, strength tempered by piety, power guided by wisdom. One of the defining features of Mursalai's rule was his emphasis on law and justice. He saw himself not as a tyrant but as a guardian of order. The Hittite legal code, already among the most advanced in the ancient world, was further refined during his reign. Unlike the harsher laws of Hammurabi, the Hittite system emphasized compensation over retribution. Crimes were to be repaid, not merely punished, a reflection of the Hittite belief that harmony must be restored, not vengeance pursued. This humane approach extended even to slaves and foreigners, who were protected under certain conditions by royal edict. In a world where cruelty was commonplace, Mursalai's laws stand as evidence of a civilization that sought fairness amid the harsh realities of empire. Still, his reign was haunted by a sense of unfinished reconciliation. Despite his victories, despite his prayers, the plague refused to relent. The gods remained silent. In time, Mursalai began to suspect that perhaps their anger was not only against his father but against himself, or even against the entire Hittite people. It was a theological crisis that mirrored the psychological burden of kingship. The Hittite king was both ruler and high priest, responsible for the moral and spiritual health of his realm. Every drought, every defeat, every outbreak of disease was a reflection of his personal failure in the eyes of the divine. To lead, therefore, was to bear not only the weight of men but also the inscrutable judgment of gods. And yet, in that struggle, Mursalai found a form of greatness that few kings achieve. His humility before the divine, his introspection, and his determination to restore balance transformed him from a mere successor into a philosopher king. His reign brought the Hittite Empire stability after years of chaos. Trade flourished once more along the routes that connected Anatolia to Syria and Mesopotamia. Cities rebuilt their temples, and agriculture recovered. Slowly, life began to return to the scarred landscape. The storm god, it seemed, had been appeased, or perhaps had simply grown silent once more. By the end of his reign, Mursalai II had achieved what few thought possible. He restored the empire his father had built, healed its political wounds, and laid the foundation for a new generation of rulers. His sons would inherit not a kingdom in collapse but one reborn through resilience and faith. Yet, even as the empire flourished once again, the lessons of Mursalai's reign remained inscribed in its soul, the understanding that no matter how powerful men became, they remained subjects of forces far greater than themselves. Mursalai II's story is one of survival against divine and mortal odds. It is a reminder that the truest strength of an empire lies not in its conquests but in its capacity to endure. His prayers, etched into clay and buried in the archives of Hattusa, still speak across 3,000 years. They are the voice of a king who faced the gods, not in arrogance, but in awe. His legacy would pass to his descendants, among them the great Muwatalli II and Hattusili III, who would lead the Hittites into the climactic age of their history, when the empire would stand toe-to-toe with the Pharaohs of Egypt in one of the most legendary confrontations of the ancient world. The age of introspection was ending. The age of confrontation was about to begin. Part 5, Muwatalli II and the Road to Kadesh. When the sun set on the reign of Mursalai II, the Hittite Empire stood once again in strength. The gods, it seemed, had finally turned their gaze back upon Hattusa with something resembling favor. The fields were fertile, the vassal states obedient, and the royal archives swelled with records of victories, treaties, and prayers. Yet beneath that calm surface lingered the ever-present tension of empire, an awareness that prosperity in the ancient world was never permanent. Mursalai's son, Muwatalli II, inherited an empire restored but restless, balanced between divine blessing and human ambition. His father had been a man of introspection. Muwatalli, by contrast, would become a man of action. And his destiny would lead him to one of the greatest military confrontations in the history of the ancient world, the Battle of Kadesh. From the beginning, Muwatalli's reign was shaped by a single question: how to preserve Hutti's supremacy in a world where power shifted as swiftly as desert sand. To the south, Egypt had reawakened under the brilliant and ambitious Pharaoh Ramesses II, a young monarch eager to reclaim his ancestors' lost glory and reassert Egyptian influence over Syria. The two empires, one forged in the highlands of Anatolia, the other born from the silt of the Nile, were destined to collide. Between them lay the contested lands of northern Syria, a region of great wealth and strategic importance. Its cities, Carchemish, Aleppo, Ugarit, were jewels of trade and culture, gateways between east and west. Both empires coveted them. For Egypt, they were a promise of renewed dominance. For the Hittites, they were the last line of defense between safety and ruin. But Muwatalli's challenges did not come solely from abroad. Within his own empire, the old divisions between the heartland and the periphery persisted. Local rulers in western Anatolia schemed for independence, while nomadic tribes along the northern frontiers, the fierce Koska people, remained an ever-present menace. The young king faced the daunting task of holding together a vast, diverse, and often divided realm. To do so, he made one of the most controversial decisions in Hittite history: he moved the empire's capital. Abandoning Hattusa, the ancient and sacred city that had served as the heart of the empire for generations, Muwatalli established a new royal seat further south, in the city of Tarhuntassa. This decision shocked his contemporaries and has puzzled historians ever since. To leave Hattusa was to leave behind its monumental temples, its archives, and its aura of divine legitimacy. Yet Muwatalli was no fool. His move was a calculated act of strategy. Tarhuntassa lay closer to the Syrian front, better positioned for military campaigns and less vulnerable to Kaska raids. It was a city of new beginnings, a symbol of a king determined to reshape his empire to meet the realities of a changing world. Still, the gods of Hattusa did not travel lightly. The priests of the storm god and the sun goddess were uneasy. Rituals had been tied to the sacred geography of Hattusa for centuries, the mountains, rivers, and sanctuaries that were believed to anchor the cosmic order itself. To remove the royal court from that holy center was to risk divine disfavor. Muwatalli understood the danger, so he carried with him the most sacred symbol of his people, the statue of the storm god of Hutti, to ensure that divine authority remained by his side. This act symbolized a profound truth about Hittite kingship: power and piety were inseparable, and every decision of state was also a negotiation with the gods. As the new capital thrived, Muwatalli turned his attention southward. Egyptian expansion into Syria had resumed with renewed vigor. Ramesses II, now in his early 20s, sought glory equal to the legendary pharaohs of old. His armies marched north, subduing rebellious cities and re-establishing Egyptian influence as far as the city of Kadesh, a fortified stronghold on the Orontes River that had long been a bone of contention between the two empires. Kadesh was more than a city, it was a symbol. Whoever controlled it controlled the trade routes of the Levant, and by extension, the balance of power in the Near East. Muwatalli could not allow it to fall. The Hittites had held Kadesh for decades, and its loss would signal weakness to vassal states watching closely for any sign of faltering authority. In preparation for the inevitable clash, the king assembled one of the largest coalitions of forces ever seen in the ancient world. From across Anatolia and northern Syria came contingents of warriors, Hittites, Syrians, Canaanites, and mercenaries from the edges of the empire. Chariots, the pride of the Hittite military, formed the core of his army. Unlike the lighter Egyptian chariots, which were swift and elegant, Hittite chariots were heavier, built for stability and power. Each carried 3 men, driver, warrior, and shield-bearer, making them formidable platforms of shock warfare. The tension between the two superpowers reached its breaking point in the 5th year of Ramesses' reign. The pharaoh's armies advanced northward through Canaan, divided into 4 divisions: Ammonius, Ra, Ta, and Set, each bearing the name of a god. Unbeknownst to him, Muwatalli's forces were already massed north of Kadesh, hidden behind the city and the river. The stage was set for one of the most famous battles in history, a clash not merely of armies, but of empires, ideologies, and the will of kings. As Ramesses' Ammonius division approached Kadesh, 2 captured Bedouin spies, planted by the Hittites, fed him false intelligence. They claimed that the Hittite army was far to the north, days away. Deceived and overconfident, the pharaoh pressed forward with only part of his army, unaware that Muwatalli's chariots waited just beyond the hills. Then, in a thunder of hooves and bronze, the trap was sprung. The Hittite chariots descended upon the Egyptian camp like a storm. Dust filled the air, the ground shook with the roar of hundreds of charging horses. The Egyptian soldiers were caught off guard, their lines collapsing under the sudden assault. Panic spread as the Hittites smashed through tents, overturned wagons, and trampled men under their wheels. For a moment, it seemed the pharaoh's army would be annihilated. The Hittite charge had achieved complete surprise, scattering the Egyptians and seizing control of their camp. Muwatalli, commanding from across the river, watched as his plan unfolded perfectly. But fate has a cruel sense of balance. Ramesses II, separated from his main forces, rallied his remaining troops with desperate courage. Mounting his chariot, he led a counterattack so bold it would be immortalized in Egyptian art for millennia. Whether exaggerated or not, Egyptian records speak of the pharaoh personally charging into the thick of battle, driving back the Hittite chariots and stabilizing his shattered lines. Soon after, reinforcements from the Ta division arrived, turning the tide once more. What had begun as a brilliant ambush became a brutal stalemate. Both sides suffered heavy losses. By nightfall, neither could claim decisive victory. The next day, the battlefield lay silent but for the groans of the wounded and the cries of the dying. Kadesh remained in Hittite hands, yet Egypt's propaganda machine would later proclaim Ramesses' glorious triumph. In truth, the Battle of Kadesh was a draw, a testament to both kings' strength and folly. For Muwatalli, it was a strategic success. The Hittites retained their control over northern Syria, and Egypt's advance was halted. For Ramesses, it was a lesson in the dangers of pride and misinformation. Yet beyond the immediate outcomes, the battle had deeper implications. It marked the beginning of a new era in diplomacy and warfare, an age in which empires would no longer simply fight for dominance but would also negotiate for survival. In the aftermath, Muwatalli returned to his capital, where the victory, if it could be called one, was celebrated with great ceremony. The gods had been honored, the borders secured. Yet the strain of constant war weighed heavily on him. His reign, though successful militarily, was marked by growing tensions within the royal family. His younger brother, Hattusili, a skilled general and administrator, had been entrusted with governing the northern territories. But as the years passed, suspicion and rivalry began to fester between the two brothers, a seed that would one day grow into civil conflict. Despite the internal discord, Muwatalli continued to strengthen the empire's southern holdings. Treaties were renewed, vassal kings reaffirmed their loyalty, and Hutti's dominance in northern Syria endured. Still, his decision to relocate the capital to Tar-Huntassa remained controversial. Many in the priesthood and nobility saw it as a betrayal of tradition. The move may have alienated the conservative factions within Hittite society, creating cracks that would later widen under his successors. When Muwatalli eventually died, his son, Urhi-Teshub, also known as Mursalai III, inherited an empire powerful but fragile, held together by the momentum of his father's will rather than true unity. Muwatalli's legacy is complex. To the Egyptians, he was the shadowed antagonist of Ramesses' heroic narrative, a nameless chief of Hutti whose cunning nearly defeated the might of the pharaoh. To his own people, he was a warrior king who preserved the empire in an age of danger, a ruler who dared to defy tradition for the sake of survival. Yet perhaps his most lasting contribution was the role he played, unknowingly, in shaping the world that would follow. For the Battle of Kadesh, despite its ambiguity, set the stage for the first recorded peace treaty in human history, forged years later between Hutti and Egypt, a treaty that would outlive both kings and stand as a testament to the dawning understanding that even empires must learn to coexist. As the fires of Kadesh faded into memory, and the scribes etched the story of the battle onto clay and stone, Muwatalli's image became part of legend, a symbol of the Hittite warrior spirit, proud and unyielding. Yet behind the armor and the triumphs lay a man shaped by his father's piety, burdened by divine responsibility, and haunted by the endless cycle of war that defined the Bronze Age world. His reign was a bridge between the age of faith and the age of diplomacy, between prayer and politics, between gods and men. And beyond him, waiting in the wings, stood his brother Hattusili, ambitious, shrewd, and destined to seize the crown himself. The struggle for the soul of the empire was far from over. Part 6, Hattusili III and the world's first peace treaty. The empire that Muwatalli II left behind was strong on the surface but fractured at its core. The Hittite gods had smiled upon his campaigns, and the borders of Hutti still stretched from the Aegean to the edge of the Levant, but beneath that facade of stability, currents of resentment and rivalry stirred. The decision to move the royal seat to Tar-Huntassa had created a rift between the traditional elites of Hattusa and the new order favored by the king. When Muwatalli died, his chosen successor, Urhi-Teshub, known in later inscriptions as Mursalai III, ascended to the throne, young, untested, and burdened by the shadow of his father's greatness. At first, the new king sought to prove himself a worthy heir. He performed the great rituals of the storm god, distributed gifts to temples, and reaffirmed treaties with vassal states. Yet it quickly became clear that his rule lacked the balance of wisdom and strength that had defined his predecessors. His authority was contested by one man above all others, his uncle Hattusili, the powerful governor of the northern provinces and brother to the late Muwatalli. Hattusili was no ordinary noble, he was a soldier, a statesman, and a survivor of countless wars. He had governed the volatile frontiers with both firmness and cunning, maintaining order where chaos might have taken root. To the soldiers and administrators of Hutti, Hattusili represented stability. To the young king, he was a rival too dangerous to ignore. The conflict between nephew and uncle was not merely political, it was deeply personal. Both men believed themselves chosen by the gods to safeguard the realm. Both drew legitimacy from the same divine traditions, the same ancestral line. And both were willing to risk everything to claim the mantle of kingship. At first, their struggle unfolded in quiet gestures, edicts challenged, officials replaced, temples reorganized. But it soon escalated into open confrontation. Mursalai attempted to strip Hattusili of his command in the north, accusing him of disloyalty. Hattusili refused, instead invoking the divine will of Ishtar of Samaha, a goddess who, he claimed, had granted him victory and favor in all things. He declared that his destiny was not to serve but to rule. The civil war that followed was brief but decisive. Hattusili, supported by seasoned generals and loyal soldiers, marched south toward Tarhuntassa. The young king's forces, caught off guard and divided, could not withstand the onslaught. In a dramatic reversal of fortune, Mursalai was deposed and exiled, likely to the land of Syria. His name was erased from monuments and official records. Hattusili III ascended the throne of Hutti, not as a usurper in his own eyes, but as a restorer, one who had been chosen by the gods to heal the wounds of division and restore divine order to the realm. Hattusili's reign began with a symbolic act of reconciliation. He restored Hattusa as the capital of the empire. The ancient city, long abandoned by Muwatalli, was once again filled with life. Temples reopened, scribes returned to their clay tablets, and the old rituals resumed. The smoke of sacrificial fires once more rose above the citadel, curling toward the sky in solemn offering to the gods of Hutti. To many, it felt as if the empire's soul had come home. Yet Hattusili knew that restoring the heart of Hutti would take more than ceremony. The civil strife had weakened the unity of the realm, and foreign powers, particularly Egypt, watched with keen interest. He needed to project not just strength, but wisdom, a new kind of kingship that could sustain an empire beset by shifting alliances and fragile peace. It was during this time that one of the most remarkable episodes in ancient diplomacy unfolded, an event that would echo through history long after both empires had turned to dust. The Battle of Kadesh, fought years earlier between Muwatalli II and Ramesses II, had never produced a decisive victor. The Hittites had retained control of Syria, but the Egyptians still claimed moral triumph. In the years that followed, both sides maintained a tense, uneasy standoff. The frontier cities, Ugarit, Amurru, Carchemish, remained potential flashpoints, their loyalties constantly tested. Yet now, with Assyria growing stronger to the east and the internal strains of empire mounting, neither Hutti nor Egypt could afford endless war. Hattusili III, pragmatic and far-sighted, recognized this. So did Ramesses II. Though separated by distance, culture, and religion, both rulers shared a common understanding: survival required diplomacy. What followed was a diplomatic achievement without precedent in human history: the creation of the first recorded international peace treaty. The correspondence began with emissaries bearing gifts and letters written on silver tablets. The tone was cautious but respectful. Over months, perhaps years, messages passed between Hattusa and Pirames, the Egyptian capital. Each letter invoked the gods as witnesses and sought to bind the two kings in mutual recognition. The resulting treaty, inscribed in both Hittite cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs, remains one of the most extraordinary artifacts of the ancient world. In essence, it was a pact of eternal friendship between the two great powers, a promise of peace, alliance, and cooperation. The treaty's words, though shaped by the rhetoric of divinity, reveal a startlingly modern sensibility. It called for mutual defense in the face of external threats, the extradition of political refugees, and an agreement not to invade or incite rebellion within each other's domains. "The great king of Egypt is my brother," the treaty proclaimed, "and the great king of Hutti is my brother. Between us shall be peace and good friendship forever." Each clause was witnessed by the gods of both nations, Ra, Seth, and Ta on one side, the storm god, the sun goddess, and Ishtar on the other. For the first time, the idea of law between nations was set into writing. This was no mere truce born of exhaustion, it was a philosophical shift, an acknowledgement that even kings answer to something higher than ambition, the principle of peace itself. Copies of the treaty were made and exchanged. One version was displayed in the Temple of Ammonius at Karnak, another was preserved in the archives of Hattusa. Today, a reproduction of it stands at the United Nations headquarters, a silent testament to the enduring legacy of that ancient accord. The alliance between Egypt and Hutti soon took on a personal dimension. To solidify the peace, Hattusili arranged for one of his daughters to marry Pharaoh Ramesses II, a royal union that sealed the bond between the two great civilizations. The ceremony was conducted with grandeur befitting the gods, blending Hittite and Egyptian customs in a rare moment of cross-cultural harmony. For a brief, luminous period, the empires that had once clashed at Kadesh became partners in stability and trade. Yet even as diplomacy flourished, challenges remained. The eastern frontier trembled under the pressure of Assyrian expansion, and the western land still murmured with unrest. Hattusili's health, too, began to fail in his later years, and with it came renewed fears for succession. He had designated his son, Tudhalia IV, as heir, but not all within the royal court supported this decision. The ghosts of earlier rivalries stirred again, whispering of betrayal and ambition. In his final years, Hattusili took solace in reflection and ritual. He saw himself as more than a conqueror or a reformer, he was a mediator between gods and men, a guardian of divine justice. His letters, preserved on clay, reveal a ruler deeply conscious of morality and fate. He spoke of the hand of the gods guiding his reign, of the sacred duty of kings to rule with fairness, and of the eternal balance that sustained the cosmos. It is this moral dimension, as much as his political acumen, that makes Hattusili III one of the most remarkable figures of the Late Bronze Age. Under his leadership, the Hittite Empire reached the height of its cultural and diplomatic influence. The archives of Hattusa swelled with correspondence from every corner of the known world, letters from Babylon, Assyria, Ugarit, and even Mycenaean Greece. The empire stood at the center of a complex web of trade and diplomacy, its influence radiating across the Near East. For a moment, it seemed as if the gods themselves had paused their storms, content to watch the empire of Hutti flourish in peace. Part 7. The Empire at its Height, the Power and Paradox of Hattusa. By the 14th century BCE, the Hittite Empire stood tall, a force that rivaled Egypt and Babylon in both military strength and political sophistication. From the heart of Anatolia, their capital city Hattusa had transformed from a fortress of survival into a symbol of imperial might. Nestled within the highlands of central Turkey, its walls snaked across the hills for miles, encircling temples, palaces, and administrative complexes. The roar of chariots echoed through its gates as envoys, soldiers, and merchants streamed in and out. Hattusa was not merely a city, it was a living monument to human ambition, endurance, and ingenuity. And at its center sat the great king of Hutti, a ruler whose word could alter the fate of nations. Life in Hattusa at this time represented the pinnacle of Hittite civilization. The empire's bureaucracy was astonishingly complex for its era. Scribes recorded every detail on clay tablets: taxes, trade agreements, military campaigns, royal decrees, and even personal letters between kings and queens. These tablets, discovered thousands of years later, revealed the inner workings of a civilization that valued law, order, and diplomacy. The Hittites were perhaps the first to establish a truly international system of correspondence among the great powers of the Bronze Age. Their royal archives contained letters exchanged with Egypt, Assyria, and Mitanni, discussions not only of trade but of peace treaties, alliances, and even marriage proposals designed to cement relations between empires. But what truly set the Hittites apart was their unique balance between power and pragmatism. Unlike the Egyptians, who saw their pharaoh as divine, the Hittite king was viewed as a mortal, chosen by the gods but not a god himself. This distinction created a fascinating political system where power was shared and delegated through councils and royal family members. It was not uncommon for the queen, known as the Tawananna, to wield immense authority, often acting as a co-ruler or even as regent. Some Hittite queens like Pujahipa were formidable diplomats, negotiating directly with foreign powers and leaving behind written correspondence that still astonishes historians today for its intelligence and insight. Militarily, the Hittites were innovators and strategists. Their armies were among the first to fully harness the power of the chariot, fast, maneuverable, and devastating on open terrain. These vehicles, often drawn by 2 horses, could carry archers who rained arrows upon their enemies before swiftly retreating to safety. The Hittite chariot divisions became legendary, feared by rivals and respected by allies. Ironically, it was the mastery of these machines of war that enabled the Hittites to secure their empire, and yet the very same instruments of battle would one day hasten their downfall when used against them. Beyond warfare, Hattusa was a center of culture and religion. The Hittites worshipped a vast pantheon of gods, each representing a force of nature, emotion, or destiny. Their religion was a mirror of their empire, diverse, layered, and inclusive. They didn't reject the gods of conquered peoples, they adopted them, integrating them into their own belief system. This made the Hittite religion one of the most complex in the ancient world, with hundreds of deities honored in ceremonies and festivals that punctuated the year. Among them, the storm god Tarhunt stood supreme, a powerful, thunder-wielding protector who symbolized strength and victory. The architecture of Hattusa reflected this divine devotion. Massive temples dedicated to the storm god and the sun goddess filled the city's sacred district, each surrounded by courtyards, altars, and storage rooms for offerings. The great temple alone stretched across a vast complex where priests conducted elaborate rituals. At night, the flicker of torches illuminated the temple walls carved with reliefs of gods and kings, a reminder of the unbreakable bond between the spiritual and the political. Trade and craftsmanship flourished under Hittite rule. Ironworking, still in its infancy elsewhere, was quietly being refined in Hittite foundries. While bronze remained the dominant metal for tools and weapons, the Hittites' early experiments with iron gave them a technological edge that would echo long after their empire's demise. Their artisans were skilled in crafting intricate jewelry, pottery, and textiles, many of which were exported through vast trade networks stretching from the Aegean to Mesopotamia. But even at its height, the Hittite Empire was not without its shadows. Internal rivalries, succession disputes, and the constant challenge of governing vast, diverse territories created cracks in its mighty foundation. The system that had once balanced power between king, queen, and council began to show strain as ambition and paranoia took hold in the royal court. Letters recovered from this era reveal plots, betrayals, and shifting alliances, stories that seem strikingly modern in their human drama. Yet, despite these tensions, the reign of kings like Suppiluliuma I and Mursilai II marked an era of relative stability and prosperity. Their campaigns extended Hittite influence deep into Syria and beyond, bringing vast wealth and prestige to Hattusa. The empire's borders now brushed against the edges of Egypt itself, setting the stage for one of the most famous encounters in ancient history, the Battle of Kadesh. As the Hittites stood on the precipice of this confrontation, they appeared unstoppable. Their cities gleamed with the wealth of trade. Their armies dominated the plains of Anatolia and Syria. Their gods seemed to favor them. Yet history has a way of reminding even the greatest empires of their fragility. What the Hittites could not see, what no empire ever truly can, was that every summit hides the beginning of a descent. The height of power often conceals the quiet tremors that signal the approach of decline. And so, as Hattusa basked in its golden age, as its chariots thundered across distant lands and its priests lifted their voices to the storm god, a subtle shift began to stir beneath the surface of this mighty civilization. Something was changing in the winds that swept across the Anatolian plateau. Something that would soon test the strength of Hutti's foundations, and determine whether its legacy would endure, or be buried by the sands of time. Part 8, The Battle of Kadesh, Clash of Empires. In the long chronicles of human history, few moments capture the grandeur and peril of ancient power as vividly as the Battle of Kadesh. It was not merely a clash between armies, it was a confrontation between two worlds, two titans of the Bronze Age, each determined to dominate the lands that connected East and West. On one side stood the Hittite Empire, under the command of the formidable King Muwatalli II, heir to the great line of Suppiluliuma. On the other side was Egypt, led by the young and ambitious Pharaoh Ramesses II, a man whose legacy would echo through millennia as one of the most celebrated rulers of the ancient world. The field of Kadesh, located along the Orontes River in what is now Syria, would become the stage for one of history's most famous and hotly contested battles. The roots of this conflict stretched deep into the tangled web of Near Eastern politics. For generations, the Hittites and Egyptians had eyed the fertile lands of Syria as a strategic prize, a region that connected the trade routes of Mesopotamia with the Mediterranean coast. Control of this territory meant wealth, power, and influence over the merchants and kingdoms that thrived there. The city of Kadesh, perched like a jewel near these crossroads, was the key to that dominance. It had changed hands several times in previous decades, each time through bloody campaigns and shifting alliances. Now, both empires prepared to settle the matter once and for all. Ramesses II, young, confident, and eager to prove his might, marched northward with an army said to number over 20,000 men, divided into 4 divisions: Ammonius, Ra, Ta, and Set. His chariots gleamed in the desert sun, banners rippled in the wind, and the rhythmic beat of drums echoed across the sands. The Egyptian army, though vast and disciplined, carried within it an arrogance that would soon be tested. For across the hills and valleys of northern Syria, the Hittite forces were already in motion, far greater in number and far more strategically positioned than Ramesses had anticipated. King Muwatalli II had anticipated Egypt's every move. From his fortified camp behind Kadesh, he commanded an army possibly exceeding 40,000 soldiers, bolstered by a massive chariot corps, the largest the world had yet seen. These chariots, each manned by 3 warriors instead of the Egyptian 2, were heavy, deadly, and designed for crushing momentum. The Hittite king also employed deception as one of his greatest weapons. Before Ramesses reached the city, Hittite spies disguised as deserters approached the Egyptian camp with a carefully crafted lie. They claimed that the Hittite army was far to the north, days away from Kadesh. Ramesses, convinced by the ruse, advanced boldly with his Ammonius division, unaware that the full might of Muwatalli's forces lay in ambush just beyond the city's walls. The moment the Egyptian vanguard set camp near Kadesh, chaos descended. From behind the hills, the Hittite chariot divisions surged forth like a thunderstorm. Hundreds of chariots, drawn by snorting horses and armed with bronze-tipped spears, smashed into the unprepared Egyptian lines. Dust and screams filled the air as soldiers scrambled to defend themselves. The Egyptian camp erupted in panic. Horses broke free, tents collapsed, and men fled into the Orontes River in desperation. Ramesses himself narrowly escaped capture, reportedly fighting from his own chariot with remarkable bravery, rallying his troops amidst the onslaught. The Egyptian pharaoh's courage that day became the stuff of legend. According to inscriptions Ramesses would later commission, he stood alone against thousands, his divine father Ammonius granting him strength as he cut through enemy ranks. "I was like Montu, the god of war," he declared in his grand monuments. Yet, behind the grandeur of these boasts, the truth was more complex. The Egyptian army, though battered, was saved only by the timely arrival of reinforcements, the Ta division, followed by allied troops from Amurru, one of Egypt's vassal states. Together, they managed to regroup, pushing back the exhausted Hittite charioteers who had overextended their assault. By sunset, the battle had devolved into a brutal stalemate. The field around Kadesh was littered with wrecked chariots, broken weapons, and the bodies of men and horses. Neither side could claim a decisive victory. Ramesses had survived, and would later proclaim himself the conqueror in countless temple carvings across Egypt, but the Hittites still held the city. Muwatalli II, pragmatic and calculating, had achieved what he wanted. Egypt's advance into northern Syria had been halted. Both sides limped away from Kadesh, their armies bloodied but their pride intact. What followed in the years after was not another war, but something far more remarkable: diplomacy. For perhaps the first time in recorded history, 2 great empires recognized the futility of endless conflict and turned instead to negotiation. Decades after the battle, the successors of Ramesses and Muwatalli signed what historians now call the Treaty of Kadesh, the earliest known recorded peace treaty in the world. Written on clay tablets in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform, it bound the 2 empires in mutual defense and respect, pledging that neither would invade the other's territory and that any fugitives would be returned safely. This treaty stands as one of humanity's earliest glimpses of international diplomacy, a moment where war gave way, however briefly, to understanding. And behind it lay the enduring legacy of Kadesh, a reminder that even the most powerful kings, even the mightiest empires, are bound by the same truths of ambition, fear, and survival. Yet, while the treaty brought peace with Egypt, the Hittites' internal troubles were far from over. Muwatalli's victory, though glorious in the annals of his time, had cost the empire dearly. The constant strain of warfare, coupled with the challenges of ruling a sprawling and diverse realm, began to erode the stability that Hattusa had long enjoyed. Beneath the surface, old rivalries simmered, alliances weakened, and the weight of empire pressed heavier than ever before. The world of the Hittites stood on the edge of something vast and uncertain. Their gods still received offerings, their kings still held court, and their chariots still rolled across the plains, but the winds of change were beginning to shift once more. The very forces that had made them great, ambition, conquest, and power, now threatened to undo them. The empire that had faced Egypt as an equal would soon find itself fighting a very different kind of battle, not for territory or glory, but for survival itself. Part 9, Whispers of Decline, the Beginning of the End. In the cool shadows of the Anatolian mountains, where the winds once carried the echoes of chariot wheels and the hum of priests in ancient temples, the great Hittite empire began to falter. For centuries, they had stood as one of the mightiest powers of the ancient Near East, warriors, diplomats, and builders who forged an empire out of stone and steel, wisdom and fear. But empires, no matter how powerful, are fragile things. They are built not only on conquests, but on faith, trade, and the delicate balance of loyalty. And when that balance begins to shift, even the mightiest foundations can crumble. After the Battle of Kadesh and the subsequent peace treaty with Egypt, the Hittites had reached a moment of uneasy stability. The empire's borders were secure, trade flourished once again through the cities of Anatolia, and the kings of Hattusa could finally breathe without the shadow of immediate war. Yet, peace brought its own challenges. Muwatalli too had moved the capital from Hattusa to Tarhuntassa, a new city further south, perhaps to be closer to the empire's contested Syrian frontiers, or perhaps to distance himself from the entrenched nobility who had grown too powerful in the old capital. This decision would have consequences far greater than he could have foreseen. The move sowed discord among the Hittite elite. The priests, nobles, and governors who had long benefited from Hattusa's central authority began to murmur in discontent. Old loyalties fractured. When Muwatalli died, his son Urhi-Teshub, also known as Mursalai III, inherited not only the throne but also a brewing storm of internal rivalries. He sought to move the capital back to Hattusa, perhaps as a gesture to restore tradition and authority, but in doing so, he provoked one of the most dangerous men of his time, Hattusili, Muwatalli's brother. Hattusili was no ordinary noble. He had proven himself a skilled general, a cunning strategist, and a man whose loyalty to the throne was matched only by his ambition. As governor of Hakpisa, he commanded armies and territories, and his influence reached far beyond the palace walls. When his nephew Mursalai III began to assert his independence and sideline him from power, Hattusili struck back with ruthless precision. What followed was not a grand battle between nations, but a war of words, plots, and betrayals within the royal family, a civil war that would fracture the unity of the Hittite heartland. The chronicles that survive from this time, etched in the clay tablets of Hattusa, read like the pages of a tragic drama. Hattusili accused his nephew of arrogance and impiety, Mursalai accused his uncle of treason. The gods, it was said, had turned their favor toward the elder. In the end, Hattusili prevailed, deposing his nephew and ascending the throne as Hattusili III. The deposed Mursalai fled south to Egypt, where he sought asylum under none other than Pharaoh Ramesses II, the same man his father had faced at Kadesh. In one of the most unexpected twists of ancient politics, Egypt and the Hittites found themselves bound not by war, but by family, for to secure the peace between their nations, Hattusili III and Ramesses II would arrange the marriage of a Hittite princess to the Egyptian pharaoh, cementing an alliance that would endure for generations. Yet, beneath the veneer of diplomacy and royal marriage, cracks continued to spread through the empire's core. The Hittite economy, once fueled by vast networks of trade, began to weaken. The climate was changing, drought struck the Anatolian plateau, harvests failed, and the rivers that had once nourished their cities ran thin. The once flourishing fields of central Anatolia began to wither, forcing migrations, famines, and unrest among the common people. Even the powerful gods of the Hittites, worshipped for centuries in great temples, seemed silent. The priests spoke of omens, of angry deities, of a world slipping out of balance. As the kingdom weakened from within, new threats began to stir beyond its borders. The western lands of Anatolia, populated by restless vassal states and ambitious warlords, grew increasingly defiant. The Ahiwa, a people many historians now associate with the Mycenaean Greeks, began raiding Hittite territories along the Aegean coast. Their ships, sleek and fast, struck without warning, plundering coastal towns and vanishing into the sea before retaliation could be organized. To the north, the Kaska tribes, long a thorn in the empire's side, descended from the mountains to raid the countryside, burning villages and capturing slaves. Hattusili III, though wise and diplomatic, could not halt the gradual decay of his realm. His reign was marked by peace with Egypt and stability at court, but it was a fragile peace, one held together by words and oaths more than by strength. His successors would inherit an empire weakened by years of internal strife, climate disaster, and growing isolation. By the time of Tudhaliya IV, the son of Hattusili, the signs of collapse were unmistakable. The roads that once connected the empire began to fall into disrepair. The great cities of Anatolia, once bustling with merchants, craftsmen, and priests, became shadows of their former selves. Hattusa, though still grand, was no longer the beating heart of a vast empire. It was a city surrounded by enemies, struggling to sustain itself. The Hittite king sent out desperate letters to their allies and vassals, begging for grain, horses, or troops. Many of these letters survive, preserved in clay, their tone growing more urgent with each passing year. One such tablet, found in the ruins of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, captures the desperation of the age. It tells of ships seen on the horizon, unknown invaders from the sea who attacked without warning, leaving destruction in their wake. The enemy ships are here, the king of Ugarit wrote in panic, and there is no way to fight them. Those invaders would later be known to history as the Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders whose sudden appearance would shatter the world of the Bronze Age. The Hittite Empire, already weakened, stood directly in their path. But it wasn't only the Sea Peoples who threatened them. Famine, rebellion, and the loss of trade all converged like dark storms around their borders. The empire that had once faced Egypt as an equal now found itself struggling to survive against forces it could neither predict nor control. Still, in those final years, there was no sense of immediate doom, only exhaustion. The Hittites had faced countless crises before and emerged stronger each time. Perhaps they believed the gods would once again deliver them. Perhaps they thought their cities, their walls, their traditions would endure. But this time, the forces gathering against them were too great, too complex, too relentless. The world was changing, and the Hittites, for all their might and wisdom, were standing on the edge of that change, unaware that they were watching the twilight of their civilization. The whispers of decline had grown into a low, persistent murmur, a sound that could be heard in the empty granaries, the silent temples, and the fading songs of the Hittite scribes. The empire that had once ruled the heart of Anatolia now stood in the long, haunting pause before its final fall. Part 10, The Fall of Hattusa, the Day the Gods Went Silent. The story of the Hittites' final days does not end in a single cataclysmic moment, but rather unfolds like a slow, echoing collapse, a fading of voices, a dimming of light, and the crumbling of once great walls. The empire that had stood for centuries, whose kings had spoken with pharaohs and whose armies had thundered across Anatolia, was about to vanish so completely that for millennia, the world would forget they had ever existed. The fall of Hattusa, their capital, was not merely the destruction of a city, it was the death of a civilization that had shaped the Bronze Age world. By the late 13th century BCE, the signs were everywhere. The letters that once carried trade and diplomacy now spoke only of famine, rebellion, and fear. In the archives of Hattusa, the tablets grow fewer and more desperate. The scribes who once chronicled victories and treaties now recorded shortages of grain, requests for troops, and pleas to the gods for deliverance. The empire's resources had been stretched beyond repair, the once thriving trade routes to the Mediterranean were blocked or destroyed, and the flow of tin, the lifeblood of bronze-making, had all but ceased. Without bronze, without trade, and without food, the heart of the empire began to starve. In the palace halls of Hattusa, King Suppiluliuma II sat on a throne that had become little more than a symbol of fading power. He was the last known Hittite king, ruling over an empire already fractured by rebellion and neglect. His reign was marked by chaos, wars against the Khaska tribes in the north, revolts in the west, and the encroaching menace of the Sea Peoples in the south. The letters he sent to his vassals and allies were urgent, sometimes pleading, sometimes defiant, but always haunted by the same underlying truth: the world was changing, and the Hittites could not keep pace. The weather grew harsher, the seasons more unpredictable. Archaeological evidence suggests a prolonged drought struck Anatolia during this period, devastating crops and livestock. The land that had once provided abundance turned barren and cracked, and rivers that had nourished the great cities of the Hittites began to dry. Hunger spread through the countryside, driving farmers and villagers to flee toward the cities in search of food. But the cities themselves were struggling. Hattusa, once a fortress of plenty, became overwhelmed by the desperate flood of refugees. Famine did what no army had managed to do: it broke the spirit of the people. Still, Suppiluliuma tried to fight back. Inscriptions discovered along the Mediterranean coast record his campaigns against enemy ships, perhaps the Sea Peoples, perhaps rebellious coastal states that had turned against Hittite control. He spoke proudly of his victories, of burning enemy vessels and reclaiming territory, but these triumphs were fleeting. Even as his armies marched, the foundations of his empire were dissolving beneath his feet. Communication lines broke down, vassals stopped sending tribute, and governors began acting as independent rulers. The unity that had once defined the Hittite Empire, the network of alliances, trade, and shared faith, disintegrated into fragments. And then, one by one, the cities fell silent. Tarhuntassa in the south was abandoned. Carchemish, a crucial stronghold near the Euphrates, found itself isolated. Hattusa, the capital, stood increasingly alone, a fortress in a dying world. Imagine, for a moment, walking through Hattusa in its final years. The colossal gates, the Lion Gate, the King's Gate, the Sphinx Gate, still stood proudly, but their carvings were worn and cracked. The great temple of the storm god Tarhunt still loomed over the city, with the scent of burnt offerings and the muttered prayers of priests who no longer knew if their gods were listening. The scribes, whose hands had once carved histories into clay, now etched their final words, inventories, warnings, laments, before abandoning their tablets forever. The city was surrounded by enemies. To the north, the Khaska tribes pressed closer, burning villages and cutting off supply lines. To the west, the lands of Arzawa and Wilusa, perhaps the historical Troy, were no longer loyal. To the south, the Sea Peoples had unleashed a wave of chaos across the eastern Mediterranean, destroying ports and cities that had once traded with the Hittites. And to the east, Assyria, once a minor power, was rising, waiting for the moment to claim what was left. No one knows exactly how Hattusa fell. There are no surviving chronicles of its final days, no eyewitness accounts of its destruction. What we have are ruins, blackened walls, collapsed temples, and scattered fragments of tablets that hint at fire and sudden abandonment. Archaeologists believe that the city was burned, its palaces and archives destroyed, its people killed or scattered. The fire that consumed Hattusa was so intense that it baked the clay tablets in its archives, preserving them for thousands of years beneath layers of ash and stone. In that sense, the city's destruction became its salvation, its memory frozen in the ruins that would one day be rediscovered. The silence that followed was immense. For centuries, Anatolia, once the center of a mighty empire, was reduced to a patchwork of small kingdoms and tribes. The knowledge of the Hittites vanished. Their language, written in cuneiform, was forgotten. Their gods, once worshipped by thousands, faded from memory. Even their name disappeared from human history. When later civilizations rose in the same land, the Phrygians, the Lydians, the Persians, none remembered that an empire had once ruled there, an empire that had rivaled Egypt and Babylon. It would take more than 3,000 years for their story to be uncovered again. In the 19th century, archaeologists exploring the highlands of central Turkey stumbled upon strange ruins, massive stone walls, broken lion statues, and buried archives filled with unfamiliar writing. At first, they thought it might be an outpost of the Assyrians or a forgotten city of early Anatolia. But as more discoveries emerged, scholars realized they had uncovered something far greater, the lost capital of an unknown empire. When the Hittite language was finally deciphered, it was as if the dead had begun to speak again. The voices of kings and priests, of scribes and soldiers, came back from the dust to tell their story, not just of their glory, but of their fall. And in those clay tablets, we find a kind of haunting poetry, a sense that the Hittites themselves had felt their end approaching, that they had watched the light of their civilization dim and had tried, in their final moments, to preserve what little they could. The fall of Hattusa is one of history's great silences, a moment when an entire civilization vanished almost overnight. Yet even in their disappearance, the Hittites left behind something extraordinary, a reminder of how fragile power can be, how even the greatest empires can vanish into dust, and how history, though it may forget, always remembers in whispers. Their gods went silent, their cities turned to ruin, but their story, buried beneath centuries of earth, waited patiently to be told again. And when it was, the world rediscovered not just a lost empire, but a lost piece of itself, a testament to human ambition, endurance, and the inevitable truth that all empires, no matter how powerful, must one day fall. Part 11, The Forgotten Millennium, Silence over Anatolia. When Hattusa fell, the world barely noticed. There was no chronicler in Babylon to mark the event, no scribe in Egypt to mourn the passing of the Hittite kings. The fall of the empire did not echo across the lands as a single great catastrophe, it dissolved quietly, like smoke fading into the wind. For nearly 1,000 years, the name of the Hittites would vanish from the memory of mankind. Their cities crumbled into hills of grass and stone. Their gods became nameless figures buried beneath the soil. The land that had once thundered with their armies returned to silence. The period that followed, roughly from 1180 BCE to 700 BCE, is one of the most mysterious in all of ancient history, a time historians once called the Dark Age. It was as though the lights of civilization had dimmed across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The great palaces of Mycenaean Greece lay in ruins. The cities of the Levant, once glittering with trade and wealth, were burned or abandoned. Even mighty Egypt, though it survived, was a shadow of its former self. Across Anatolia, chaos reigned. The Hittite Empire had held the region together through a delicate web of alliances, trade, and religious unity. With its fall, that balance shattered. In the ruins of their world, smaller kingdoms rose, fragments of the old empire, like embers glowing faintly in the dark. These Neo-Hittite states, as archaeologists would later call them, carried on bits and pieces of Hittite culture, their language, their gods, their art. But they no longer commanded the vast power of the old capital. In the south, the kingdom of Carchemish became the most important of these survivors. Perched on the banks of the Euphrates, it had once been a key Hittite stronghold, ruled by a branch of the royal family. When Hattusa fell, Carchemish endured. Its kings took up the ancient Hittite titles, great king, hero, son of the storm god, as if to keep the spirit of the old empire alive. From there, they ruled over the remnants of the Hittite world, protecting what they could from the advancing powers to the east and south. Farther west, other city-states clung to life, Melid, Kuma, Gergum, Samal, and Taanat among them. Their kings carved inscriptions in both Luwian hieroglyphs and Aramaic, blending the old with the new. They built temples to Tarhunt, the storm god, and Kababa, the mother of the gods, gods that had once stood at the heart of the Hittite pantheon. But their walls were smaller, their armies weaker, and their reach limited. Each was an island of memory in a sea of change. Yet, even in this decline, something remarkable happened. The Hittite legacy did not disappear entirely, it transformed. In art, architecture, and language, traces of their civilization continued to shape the cultures that came after. The great stone lions that once guarded Hattusa inspired the monumental gateways of later kingdoms. The idea of the storm god, ruler of heaven and earth, lived on in the pantheons of Syria, Phrygia, and eventually even Greece. The old Hittite deities did not die, they simply changed their names and faces, reborn in the myths of other peoples. Meanwhile, in central Anatolia, a new people began to rise, the Phrygians. They were not of Hittite blood, but they inherited the lands that had once been Hittite heartland. Around 1100 BCE, they moved into the ruins of the old cities, rebuilding and reusing the stones of Hittite temples and palaces. To them, the remains of the Hittites were ancient even then, mysterious, sacred, and perhaps haunted. The Phrygians built their own culture atop the bones of the old one, and though they never knew the full story of the Hittites, they walked among their ghosts. To the south, in the region known as Cilicia, the Luwians, once subjects of the Hittite kings, continued to thrive. They spoke a language related to Hittite, used the same hieroglyphic script, and worshipped similar gods. Their art and inscriptions reveal a blend of resilience and adaptation, proof that while empires fall, cultures endure. But beyond these faint echoes, the memory of the Hittite Empire was erased. For later civilizations, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Hittites simply did not exist. They left no grand monuments like the pyramids of Egypt, no immortal epics like those of Mesopotamia. Their cities were buried, their language undeciphered, their gods unnamed. Even the Bible, which mentions the Hittites, likely referred to these later Neo-Hittite kingdoms rather than the great empire that had once rivaled Egypt. The land itself seemed to absorb their memory. The hills around modern Bagaskoi, where Hattusa once stood, became known only as places of myth, whispers of ancient kings, lost cities, and forgotten gods. Shepherds grazed their flocks among the ruins, unaware that beneath their feet lay the remains of palaces and archives. For thousands of years, the stones of Hattusa slept beneath the earth, their carvings worn smooth by time. Meanwhile, in distant lands, the world moved on. The Assyrians rose in the east, building a brutal empire on the foundations the Hittites had left behind. The Babylonians followed, then the Persians, and finally the Greeks. Each built upon the bones of older civilizations, each believing themselves to be the pinnacle of human achievement. Yet beneath their triumphs lay the buried echoes of the Hittites, the first Indo-European empire, the forgotten architects of the ancient world. The silence lasted for millennia. When travelers and scholars finally returned to the Anatolian highlands in the 19th century, they found strange stone ruins, lions carved into gates, colossal walls, and fragments of hieroglyphs unlike anything known in Egypt or Mesopotamia. These ruins spoke of a civilization that did not fit anywhere in the known history of the ancient world. Who had built them? What language had they spoken? No one knew. For decades, the mystery deepened. Some believed the ruins were remnants of the Assyrians or even of a lost people mentioned in the Bible. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that archaeologists finally uncovered the truth. The clay tablets found in the ruins of Bagaskoi, written in cuneiform but in an unknown tongue, would prove to be the key. When scholars deciphered them, they realized they were reading the language of the Hittites, a language that had been silent for over 3,000 years. With that discovery, the forgotten millennium came to an end. The silence broke. The Hittites, once erased from memory, spoke again. Through the tablets of their scribes, the inscriptions of their kings, and the stones of their temples, they told their story, not just of power and conquest, but of loss and endurance. The rediscovery of the Hittites was more than an archaeological triumph. It was a reminder of how fragile human memory can be, how entire civilizations can vanish beneath the soil, waiting to be found again. It was also a warning that the rise and fall of empires is not the exception, but the rule. Every age believes itself immortal, yet time buries all things eventually. The Hittites' forgotten millennium teaches us that even silence is part of history. Beneath every ruin, beneath every layer of dust and time, there are voices waiting to be heard, voices that once sang to their gods, built their cities, and dreamed that their names would last forever. But even the mightiest dreams fade. What remains, always, is the earth, patient, watchful, and eternal. Part 12, Rediscovery, when the Hittites spoke again. For more than 3,000 years, the Hittites had been nothing more than a whisper in the dust, a forgotten empire buried beneath the soil of Anatolia. The world had moved on, civilizations had risen and fallen, and yet, in the quiet hills of central Turkey, their story waited patiently beneath layers of earth and time. Then, in the late 19th century, something extraordinary happened. The silence began to break. The Hittites, long thought to be lost forever, were about to speak again. The rediscovery of the Hittites did not begin with a grand archaeological expedition or a royal decree. It began with curiosity. In the 1830s and 1840s, European travelers and explorers began to wander through the landscapes of modern-day Turkey, searching for traces of the civilizations mentioned in the Bible and ancient texts. They expected to find the ruins of Assyrians or Persians, perhaps relics of ancient Phrygia or Lydia. What they found instead were enormous stone sculptures and mysterious hieroglyphs, symbols no one could read. In 1834, a French explorer named Charles Texier made his way to a remote region called Bogazkoy, nestled among the hills near the Kızılırmak River. There, he stumbled upon vast ruins, massive stone walls, carved gates, and strange reliefs of warriors, gods, and animals. Texier was stunned. The sight was unlike anything he had ever seen. He drew detailed sketches of the ruins and published his findings in Europe. Scholars were fascinated but confused. No one knew what civilization these ruins belonged to. The inscriptions on the stones were unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform. They seemed to belong to a culture completely unknown to history. For decades, the mystery lingered. Who had built these cities? What language had they spoken? Some scholars believed they might be remnants of an Assyrian outpost, others thought they were Phrygian or even early Persian. The ancient world had many lost peoples, and it was easy to imagine these ruins belonging to any of them. But the symbols carved into the stones, intricate, abstract, filled with human and animal figures, hinted at something older and more complex. By the 1870s, more discoveries began to surface. In northern Syria, near the town of Aleppo, explorers found similar carvings and inscriptions. They realized that these mysterious symbols extended across a vast region, from central Turkey to the Levant. Whoever these people were, they had once ruled or influenced a large part of the ancient world. The puzzle pieces were slowly coming together, but the full picture remained hidden. Then came Bogazkoy, the key to it all. In 1906, a German archaeologist named Hugo Winkler decided to excavate the site that Texier had discovered 70 years earlier. He had a hunch that the ruins might belong to a city mentioned in Assyrian records, a powerful northern kingdom known as Hutti. What Winkler found would rewrite the history of the ancient world. His team unearthed hundreds of clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform. But when they began to read them, they realized something extraordinary. The language was not Akkadian, Babylonian, or Assyrian. It was something entirely new. A language no one had ever seen before. The tablets mentioned kings, gods, treaties, and wars. They told of a people called the Hittites, and a mighty city named Hattusa. The forgotten empire had finally spoken. It took years to decipher the tablets, but by the 1910s, scholars had made a breakthrough. A Czech linguist named Bedřich Hrozný realized that the unknown language was not Semitic like Akkadian, nor Sumerian like the ancient texts of Mesopotamia. It was Indo-European, related to the same linguistic family as Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. This discovery was revolutionary. It meant that the Hittites were the earliest known Indo-European civilization, the linguistic ancestors of much of Europe and South Asia. Hrozny's famous moment came when he read a single line of Hittite text aloud and recognized its meaning, Ninda and Ezatini waterma ekutini, you will eat bread and drink water. The structure and vocabulary were unmistakably Indo-European. With that realization, the lost voice of the Hittites was finally understood. As more tablets were translated, the full scope of the Hittite Empire began to emerge. The documents revealed a complex and highly organized state, kings, queens, officials, and priests, detailed records of diplomacy, trade, and religion. The archives of Hattusa included copies of treaties with Egypt, including the Treaty of Kadesh, the oldest known peace treaty in history. For the first time, modern scholars realized that the Hittites had once been a superpower, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Egyptians and Mesopotamians. Archaeological discoveries quickly followed. The massive gates of Hattusa were excavated, the Lion Gate, the King's Gate, and the Sphinx Gate, each one guarded by monumental sculptures. The city walls stretched for miles, enclosing palaces, temples, and archives. The city's layout revealed careful urban planning, monumental architecture, and artistic sophistication. The rock sanctuary of Yazilikiah, located just outside Hattusa, was uncovered, a sacred open-air temple where the gods of the Hittite pantheon were carved in procession along the walls. The more archaeologists uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The Hittites were not a minor or peripheral people. They were the architects of one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, hidden for millennia beneath the soil of Anatolia. And yet, even as their story re-emerged, it carried a haunting sense of loss. Unlike Egypt, which had endured continuously for thousands of years, or Mesopotamia, whose cities were mentioned in every ancient chronicle, the Hittites had truly vanished. There were no direct descendants, no living memory, no continuous tradition linking the ancient empire to the modern world. The rediscovery of their ruins was like resurrecting a ghost, a reminder that history, no matter how deeply buried, never disappears completely. By the mid-20th century, the rediscovery of the Hittites had transformed archaeology. Scholars realized that Anatolia was not merely a bridge between East and West, it had been one of the birthplaces of civilization in its own right. The Hittite language became one of the key pillars in understanding the development of Indo-European tongues. The study of their religion and mythology revealed connections that rippled through the mythic traditions of Greece and the Near East, from Zeus, the storm god, to the flood myths that appear across ancient cultures. Today, the ruins of Hattusa are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a silent testament to a people who once ruled a vast empire and then vanished without a trace. Visitors who walk among its ruins see the same lion statues and gates that Charles Texier once sketched nearly 2 centuries ago. They stand before the same stones where kings like Suppiluliuma and Hattusili once walked. And though the city is silent now, its story speaks louder than ever. The rediscovery of the Hittites is more than a tale of archaeology. It is a story of memory regained, of how history can be lost and then found again. It reminds us that even when civilizations fade into legend, their voices endure in the earth, waiting for someone to listen. The stones of Hattusa, once buried beneath centuries of silence, now tell a story that bridges the past and the present. They whisper of ambition, faith, empire, and fall, and of humanity's endless desire to remember. Because, in the end, no civilization is truly gone until its story is told. And after 3,000 years of silence, the Hittite story is finally being told again, in their own words, spoken through the dust and clay, across the ages. Part 13, The Hittite Legacy, Echoes Through Empires and Time. The fall of the Hittite Empire around 1200 BCE might have seemed, at first glance, like the closing of a chapter, a final silence descending upon the Anatolian highlands. But history, like memory, does not end when a city burns or when a king dies. The Hittites may have vanished as a political power, but their influence continued to ripple across the ancient world, threading quietly through languages, beliefs, and political ideas that shaped civilizations for centuries to come. Their legacy, though fragmented, became one of those invisible foundations upon which later empires unknowingly built their own greatness. To understand the Hittite legacy, we must begin not with their ruins, but with their words. The rediscovery of their written language, one of the earliest known Indo-European tongues, was more than an academic curiosity. It connected the Hittites directly to a linguistic lineage that would later produce Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and eventually the modern languages of Europe and South Asia. This revelation reshaped the map of human history. Before Hittite cuneiform was deciphered, scholars believed that the Indo-European family originated somewhere in Eastern Europe or the Caucasus. But the Hittites' presence in Anatolia pushed that timeline and geography much further back, revealing that this ancient people were one of the first great carriers of a linguistic and cultural heritage that still echoes in modern speech. Even beyond language, the Hittites' approach to law and governance left an intellectual imprint that feels surprisingly modern. Their legal codes, preserved on clay tablets, reveal a society that sought balance between authority and justice. Unlike the often brutal punishments of Babylonian law, the Hittite system showed a degree of compassion and rationality. Fines often replaced the death penalty, and laws addressed issues ranging from property disputes to marital rights and even the treatment of slaves. They displayed a remarkable sense of practicality and fairness, suggesting that the Hittites valued stability and order above vengeance. This legal tradition, filtered through the ages, likely influenced the governance systems of later Anatolian and Near Eastern states, subtly weaving Hittite pragmatism into the political DNA of the region. Then there was religion, the spiritual heart of their civilization, and perhaps the most enduring strand of their legacy. The Hittites worshipped a pantheon of thousands of gods, each one tied to a city, river, or mountain. Their belief system was a vast, intricate web that linked the divine with the natural world. Among their deities, the most important was Tar-Hun, the storm god, ruler of the skies and bringer of rain. His battles with the serpent Ilyanka, the eternal struggle between order and chaos, became one of the most enduring mythological motifs of the ancient world. When Greek myths later told of Zeus battling Typhon, or when Babylonian legends spoke of Marduk defeating Tiamat, echoes of the Hittite storm god's victory resounded in their verses. It's as though the myths of the Hittites were absorbed into the bloodstream of the ancient world, passing from culture to culture, reshaped but never forgotten. Even in the Bible, when references to Hittites appear among the peoples of Canaan, they serve as distant echoes of a civilization that had once stood as mighty as Egypt itself. The Hittites' religion also gave us something subtler but equally profound, a model of cultural integration. The empire had been home to countless ethnic groups, Hattaians, Luwians, Hurrians, and rather than impose a single rigid faith, the Hittite kings adopted and blended the gods of their subjects. Their empire was a living mosaic of spiritual traditions, where Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and local Anatolian deities all coexisted under one divine hierarchy. This inclusiveness, this willingness to merge beliefs rather than destroy them, laid early groundwork for the syncretic religious traditions that would later flourish under empires like Persia, Greece, and Rome. Their engineering and urban planning also left an enduring mark. The city of Hattusa, with its monumental gates, sprawling temples, and fortified walls, became a model for later urban centers in Anatolia. The use of cyclopean stonework, terraced layouts, and water storage systems influenced the architectural approaches of later civilizations. Their mastery of metallurgy, especially their early use of iron, signaled a turning point in human history. Though the Iron Age would not fully emerge until after their fall, the Hittites were among the first to experiment with iron smelting, giving them a technological advantage that terrified their enemies and inspired later generations of smiths and warriors. And perhaps one of the most profound elements of their legacy lies in diplomacy. The Treaty of Kadesh, signed between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II, remains the oldest known international peace treaty in the world. It set out not only terms of peace but also mutual defense agreements, extradition clauses, and promises of fair treatment for refugees, concepts that form the very backbone of modern international law. A replica of this treaty hangs today in the United Nations headquarters in New York, a silent acknowledgement that the principles of diplomacy we rely on today were pioneered over 3,000 years ago by a civilization long forgotten by name. But beyond all these measurable legacies, the laws, the language, the architecture, the treaties, there is something more elusive, something emotional. The story of the Hittites, rediscovered after millennia of silence, reminds humanity of its own fragility. Their disappearance was not just a historical event, it was a warning written in ruins. It shows how even the greatest of powers can vanish, how entire worlds can be erased by war, famine, or time. Yet it also shows how memory endures, how no story ever truly dies as long as someone seeks to understand it. In that sense, the Hittites' greatest legacy may not be their empire or their gods, but their resurrection. They taught us that history is not a straight line but a circle, that civilizations rise, fall, and rise again in memory. The rediscovery of Hattusa was not just an archaeological triumph, it was a resurrection of identity, a reclaiming of humanity's forgotten chapters. When we read the words of their treaties, study their tablets, or walk among their ruins, we are not simply studying a dead civilization. We are hearing a voice that speaks across 3,000 years, calm, dignified, and enduring. It is the voice of a people who once ruled with wisdom and faith, who built cities of stone and laws of compassion, and who believed, above all, in the balance between gods and men. Today, when the wind blows across the ruins of Hattusa, it carries that same voice, faint but clear. It whispers through the lion gates, drifts over the broken walls, and echoes among the stones carved with the names of forgotten kings. It reminds us that the Hittites, though long gone, are still speaking, not in power or conquest, but in the quiet persistence of their legacy. For in the end, the Hittites were never truly lost. They were waiting, patient and silent, for the world to remember. And now, after 3 millennia, we finally do. Part 14, The Enduring Mystery, What Really Caused the Fall of the Hittites? History rarely gives us clean answers, and when it comes to the Hittites, the question of their fall remains one of the great enigmas of the ancient world. How could an empire so vast, so sophisticated, and so deeply entrenched in the Bronze Age power structure vanish almost overnight? How could the builders of monumental cities, masters of diplomacy and iron, the equals of Egypt and Babylon, simply disappear, leaving behind only ruins and whispers? The mystery of the Hittites' downfall has puzzled historians, archaeologists, and linguists for over a century, and even today, the answers remain incomplete. What is clear, however, is that their collapse was not the result of a single event, but rather the culmination of many interconnected disasters, political, environmental, and human, that converged to bring an empire to its knees. The story begins in the late 13th century BCE, when the Hittite Empire reached the height of its power under kings like Suppiluliuma I and Mursilai II. Their dominion stretched from central Anatolia to northern Syria, controlling trade routes that linked the Aegean to Mesopotamia. The empire's capital, Hattusa, stood as a marvel of organization and strength, a fortified city of stone walls and sacred temples. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. The very system that sustained the empire, its reliance on vassal states, complex alliances, and far-flung resources, was also its greatest weakness. The first tremors of collapse came from the edges. The subject kingdoms that had once sworn loyalty to the great king of Hutti began to waver. In places like Arzawa and Kizzuwatna, local rulers grew restless under Hittite oversight. The empire's distant territories, especially in northern Syria, faced pressure from emerging powers, most notably the Assyrians, who were beginning their own rise to dominance. The Assyrians' ambitions clashed with Hittite interests, and conflicts over border cities and trade rights became increasingly costly. Every skirmish stretched Hutti's resources thinner, every rebellion weakened its hold on the periphery. Then came the mysterious phenomenon that historians have come to call the Bronze Age collapse, a period of widespread destruction and upheaval across the eastern Mediterranean, around 1200 BCE. Almost simultaneously, great cities such as Mycenae, Ugarit, and Troy fell into ruin. Trade routes that had connected kingdoms for centuries disintegrated, plunging the region into a dark age of isolation and scarcity. The cause of this catastrophe remains one of the most debated topics in ancient history, but several factors seem to have played a part. One of the most dramatic theories involves the so-called Sea Peoples, bands of raiders and migrants who appeared seemingly out of nowhere, attacking coastal cities and disrupting maritime trade. Egyptian inscriptions describe Pharaoh Ramses III fighting off these invaders, who came from the lands of the north. It is very likely that the same groups also targeted Anatolia, destabilizing Hittite ports and supply lines. Archaeological evidence from western and southern Turkey shows signs of widespread destruction around this time: burned cities, abandoned settlements, layers of ash and debris. To an empire dependent on imported grain, tin, and luxury goods, such disruptions would have been devastating. But the Sea Peoples alone cannot explain everything. Environmental evidence suggests that the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE were marked by a series of prolonged droughts and famines. Tree ring and pollen data from across Anatolia show a significant decrease in rainfall during this period. Crops failed, rivers dried, and food shortages became widespread. Letters discovered in the archives of Ugarit and Hattusa describe desperate pleas for grain shipments, evidence of a system stretched to its limits. When an empire depends on surplus to feed its armies and sustain loyalty, famine is more dangerous than any army. Internal strife compounded these external pressures. The later Hittite kings faced palace intrigue, political assassinations, and civil unrest. The throne of Hutti, once the seat of divine kingship, became a battlefield of ambition. Succession disputes fractured the royal line, and generals loyal to different princes turned their weapons against each other instead of their enemies. One surviving letter from the final years of the empire hints at betrayal within the capital itself, a desperate king accusing his own officials of treachery. The great unity that had defined the Hittite state was gone, replaced by distrust and desperation. Economically, the empire's collapse was almost inevitable once its trade network disintegrated. The Hittites' prosperity relied on bronze, a metal alloy that required tin, a resource not found in Anatolia. When trade routes bringing tin from Central Asia or the Levant were cut off, the entire foundation of Bronze Age warfare, agriculture, and craftsmanship began to crumble. Iron technology, though known to the Hittites, was still in its infancy and could not immediately replace bronze. The empire, like many of its neighbors, simply could not adapt quickly enough. As the situation worsened, cities began to fall one by one. Archaeological excavations in Hattusa reveal clear signs of violent destruction: collapsed buildings, charred debris, smashed idols, and abandoned homes. The grand temples were looted, the palace burned, and the archives buried under rubble. There are no records describing the fall itself. It is as if the scribes stopped writing in the midst of chaos. The silence that follows in the archaeological record is haunting. No successor dynasty emerges, no recovery takes place. The Hittite heartland was simply deserted. Yet the Hittite people themselves did not vanish entirely. Some fled south, establishing what historians call the Neo-Hittite kingdoms in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia. Cities like Carchemish, Melid, and Kuma became refuges for the remnants of Hittite culture, preserving their art, language, and religion for several more centuries. These smaller states maintained the old traditions, still calling their rulers great kings, even though their territories were only fragments of the former empire. They continued to carve their hieroglyphs on stone, depicting kings standing before storm gods, invoking the same divine protection their ancestors once sought. In time, even these Neo-Hittite states would fall, to the growing might of Assyria and the relentless march of new powers. But their survival for a few generations ensured that the memory of the Hittites did not disappear entirely. Through their art, their treaties, and their monuments, something of the old Hutti endured. The fall of the Hittites, then, was not a single tragedy but a slow unraveling, the result of climate, conflict, and human fragility intertwined. Their end reflects a universal truth of history, that civilizations, no matter how mighty, are always at the mercy of both nature and their own ambitions. The Hittites had built an empire of stone, law, and faith, but even the strongest walls cannot stand against hunger, division, and time. And yet, their disappearance gave birth to one of history's most fascinating mysteries. For thousands of years, the world forgot the Hittites. Their cities were lost, their gods unnamed, their language unreadable. It wasn't until the late 19th century, when archaeologists stumbled upon strange ruins in the hills of central Turkey, that the story of the Hittites began to re-emerge from the dust. In rediscovering them, humanity not only found a missing piece of its past but also a reflection of its own impermanence. The ruins of Hattusa stand today as a monument to that mystery: colossal walls encircling empty courtyards, gates adorned with lions and sphinxes staring eternally into the Anatolian horizon. They remind us that no empire, no matter how powerful, can escape the cycle of creation and decay. The Hittites fell, but in their fall, they became immortal. Their silence turned into a story, their ruins into a lesson, their forgotten name into a whisper that still carries across the ages. And as night settles over those ruins, one can almost imagine the sound of ancient prayers rising again, the voice of a civilization calling out to the gods that once ruled their skies, asking, as we still do today, what brings an empire to its end? And what, if anything, allows it to be remembered? Part 15, Rediscovery and Resurrection: How the Modern World Found the Hittites Again. For over 3,000 years, the Hittites were ghosts in the corridors of time, a people erased so completely from memory that even their name vanished from human knowledge. Unlike the Egyptians, whose pyramids defied time, or the Babylonians, whose stories echoed through the Bible, the Hittites slipped quietly into oblivion. By the dawn of the modern era, their once mighty empire was nothing more than a faint biblical reference, an obscure footnote that many scholars doubted had ever existed at all. Yet, hidden beneath the hills of central Anatolia, the stones of Hattusa still waited, silent and patient, for the world to find them again. The rediscovery of the Hittites is one of archaeology's most thrilling detective stories, a blend of curiosity, persistence, and sheer accident that unfolded across the 19th and early 20th centuries. It began, as many great discoveries do, with a question. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars studying the Old Testament encountered puzzling references to a people called the Hittites, a nation that seemed to have interacted with both the Israelites and the Egyptians. But outside of these scriptures, there was no trace of such a civilization in recorded history. Some dismissed them as a minor tribe or a literary invention, while others suspected that the Bible might have preserved a faint memory of a once great empire lost to time. The search for the Hittites began in earnest in the mid-1800s, as European explorers, driven by imperial curiosity and scholarly ambition, roamed through the ancient lands of the Near East. It was during this era that archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Nineveh, Babylon, and Troy, each rediscovery reshaping our understanding of human history. Yet, central Anatolia remained largely unexplored, its vast highlands hiding secrets that even seasoned travelers overlooked. In 1834, a French explorer named Charles Texier stumbled upon a series of mysterious ruins near the modern Turkish village of Bagazkoy. What he saw astonished him: massive stone walls, gates guarded by carved lions, and strange inscriptions unlike anything he had encountered before. Texier believed he had found the ancient city of Tyria mentioned by Herodotus, but he could not identify the culture responsible for the site. His discovery was remarkable, yet it lay dormant for decades, unrecognized for what it truly was, the capital of the lost Hittite Empire. Over the following decades, other explorers and archaeologists began to take interest in Anatolia's enigmatic ruins. Among them was Archibald Sayce, a British scholar who, in the 1870s, made a bold claim. After studying a series of mysterious hieroglyphs found in central and southern Turkey, inscriptions carved on stone blocks and rock faces, Sayce proposed that they belonged to a previously unknown ancient civilization. He suggested that these inscriptions might be the work of the biblical Hittites. His theory was met with skepticism. Many scholars dismissed it as fanciful speculation, but Sayce's intuition proved astonishingly accurate. The final breakthrough came in the early 20th century, thanks to a German archaeologist named Hugo Winkler. In 1906, Winkler, together with the Ottoman archaeologist Theodore Macready, began systematic excavations at Bagazkoy, the site first noted by Texier. What they uncovered transformed history. Beneath the soil lay the sprawling ruins of an ancient metropolis, temples, fortifications, and royal archives filled with thousands of clay tablets written in a language no one could read. These were not the remnants of a small local kingdom, but of a powerful empire that had once rivaled Egypt and Babylon. The discovery of those tablets was revolutionary. Once deciphered, they revealed a world previously unknown to history. Here were royal decrees, diplomatic letters, religious hymns, treaties, and even myths written in cuneiform, the same script used in Mesopotamia, but expressing a language entirely distinct from Akkadian or Sumerian. It was, at long last, the voice of the Hittites themselves, preserved in clay for over 3 millennia. But before the world could hear that voice, someone had to learn to read it. This monumental task fell to the Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný, a man of immense determination and linguistic genius. In 1915, after years of studying the strange tablets, Hrozný announced that he had cracked the code. The language of the Hittites, he declared, was not Semitic or Mesopotamian but Indo-European, related to Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. To prove his point, he famously translated a simple Hittite sentence, Nu ninda and ezatini waterma ekatini, which he rendered as, now you will eat bread and drink water. It was an astonishing revelation. The Hittites were not only real, they were the earliest known speakers of an Indo-European tongue, linking them directly to the linguistic ancestry of much of modern Europe and South Asia. The rediscovery of the Hittites rewrote the map of the ancient world. Until then, historians had imagined the great powers of the Late Bronze Age as a triangle between Egypt, Babylon, and Mycenae. The Hittite Empire, emerging from the Anatolian highlands, suddenly completed the picture. They were the missing fourth pillar, a civilization that had negotiated treaties with Ramses the Great, waged wars across Syria, and shaped the political balance of their era. The world that had once been shrouded in myth became tangible once again, as archaeologists pieced together the life of a people forgotten for 3,000 years. Excavations at Hattusa and other sites such as Alacahoyuk, Yazilikaya, and Karchemish revealed the full grandeur of Hittite civilization. Hattusa's great gates, the Lion Gate, the King's Gate, and the Sphinx Gate, still stand, their carvings fierce and eternal. The rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya, filled with reliefs of gods and kings, offered a glimpse into the Hittite spiritual world, where divine processions were etched into living stone. The archives uncovered at Hattusa contained one of the world's oldest known international treaties, the Treaty of Kadesh between the Hittites and Egypt, a document that stands as a testament to their diplomatic sophistication. The rediscovery of the Hittites did more than expand historical knowledge, it changed how we think about the nature of civilization itself. It reminded scholars that history is full of silences, that countless societies may have risen and fallen without leaving behind monumental legacies like Egypt's pyramids or Rome's marble. The Hittites, who had once stood among the greatest powers of the Bronze Age, had vanished into anonymity for millennia, proving how fragile the memory of empire truly is. Today, the story of the Hittites continues to unfold. Archaeologists still excavate new sites across Turkey, unearthing artifacts that shed light on their daily life, trade, and beliefs. The Hittite capital of Hattusa has been declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, drawing visitors from around the world who walk among the same stones once tread by ancient kings. The language once buried in clay is now taught in universities, its words resurrected from silence. Through the work of scholars and explorers, the Hittites have been brought back into the grand narrative of human history, no longer forgotten, but remembered as pioneers of diplomacy, law, and culture. Their rediscovery is more than an archaeological triumph, it is a reminder that the past is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. Beneath the dust of centuries, beneath forgotten names and broken walls, history holds its breath until curiosity stirs it awake. The Hittites, who vanished without a trace, now speak again, their voices carried across time in the language of clay and stone, in the echoes of prayers carved into rock, in the rhythm of rediscovered stories that refuse to die. And as we close this long journey through their rise, glory, fall, and resurrection, one truth becomes clear: the Hittites are not just a relic of the past, they are a testament to the resilience of human memory. Civilizations may crumble, but stories endure. The Hittites remind us that even after 3,000 years of silence, history still whispers, if only we know how to listen.